Welcome to the Scholar Chronicles. This is Dr. Loh KS, a historian, and I ask fellow scholars to share interesting stories from the field. Scholars, we all have these stories and we talk about them privately, but rarely in public. So, what this podcast tries to do is to bring these stories to the forefront in public and discuss them because I think these stories usually have a bearing on our research. They are interesting, they shed light on the research that we do, the methods we use, the challenges we face. We often face challenges, and ultimately the relationship between scholarship and society. So we hope through the podcast help us to get people to understand what is academic research, and ultimately also to help scholars do their research a little bit better. Do like the video and subscribe to the channel for future episodes. With us today is someone I met about a decade ago, whose name is almost synonymous with oral history. And besides being an established scholar, a very helpful man, very helpful scholar, given me lots of advice about writing oral history, doing oral history, as well as teaching oral history. My friend also told me that he ran a fantastic workshop on oral history, I think in Melbourne. Our guest today is Alistair Thomson, of course. Hello, Al. How are you?
Very well, thanks, KS. Good to see you.
As we were saying just now, you're looking fantastic.
Well, I retired from the university last year for a lot of reasons, but it's been great to go freelance, which is really how I started as a historian, as a freelance. And then for a whole range of reasons, I needed a proper job with kids and mortgages and so on. And 30 years later, I'm now going back to what I was doing back in the 1980s as a freelance oral historian, teaching, researching, writing, helping organizations, etc. It's great. I love it.
Let's jump into it. So how did that start? So did you go the formal way into academia, doing a PhD and all that?
Yeah, look, I did a undergraduate degree at Melbourne University and ended up majoring in history. My first interview was with my grandmother, and I think it was 1979. And she had grown up in rural Victoria, from a working class mining town in the middle of nowhere in the hills. And she got a scholarship to Melbourne and ended up being the first woman graduate of agricultural science in the Southern Hemisphere. And I interviewed her. It was my first interview, and she described in 1915 going up on the stage to get her graduation certificate. All the men had gone away to war, so she was the only person graduating. And she tells this extraordinary story where she remembered her fear about being the only woman. It's pretty unusual being a woman and the only person going on stage, and another academic woman pushed her up the stage. And yeah, so it was just wonderful. I mean, and I found that cassette that I recorded in 1979 a few years ago, and to be able to replay your grandmother's voice and remember her through her voice was really pretty special. So that was my sort of informal introduction to oral history. And then my last year of undergraduate, I was doing a course about Australia between the wars, and with a wonderful historian called Lloyd Robson. And I got interested in, well, what happened to the Australian First World War veterans when they came home from the war to working class suburbs in Melbourne. And I went up, I was living near Brunswick, working class suburb, and I went to the Brunswick Return Services League, and they gave me contacts for First World War veterans who were members. And I got an old cassette recorder and just went out and did some pretty terrible interviews in terms of the audio quality, but I fell in love with it. I remember turning up to interview a man called James McNair. He comes to the door in a silk dressing gown, offers me a glass of whiskey. It was probably mid-morning, and proceeded to just tell me this extraordinary story about his war and about coming home. And he sang songs from the war. And I realized just being able to ask someone to tell you their story just could open up so much and was so rich and so powerful. And I really fell in love with oral history then. And that project ended up becoming what was the PhD, Anzac Memories, where I interviewed more working class veterans, also from Melbourne. And in the PhD, it took me a while to work out what it was about, but it was really about these men's experience before, during, and after the war, but also how they'd made sense of their war experience and remembered it, and how they'd lived with and sometimes against the very public Anzac legend, the narrative, the very powerful cultural narrative of Australians at war. which sort of recognised but also misrecognised these men's experience, particularly working class men, and particularly their experiences of coming home and struggling. And so that Anzac Memories was partly about the First World War experience and memory in Australia. It was also partly about trying to understand how to work with oral history as a source that's both a historical source about what's happened in the past, but also a memory source about how the past is remembered both by individuals and in the wider society, and how our memories interact with those wider cultural memories. So that was Anzac Memories, which was published in, I think, 1994. And then I went back to it for a second edition after all the veterans I'd interviewed had died. The book focused in particular on three men. And I went back and their pension records became available almost miraculously. They were going to be thrown out and then they were saved. And there's just miles of archive records of all the Australian war veterans who basically survived the war and came back and applied for war pensions. And some of the people I'd interviewed had records that start in 1917, ran through until their death in 1992. So I was able to go back to the people I'd interviewed, these three men in particular, and look at how they had battled with the Department of Veterans Affairs over 50 or 60 years, telling and retelling their story of the war and how their story of the war was shaped in this battle to get pensions for shell shock, wound injuries, etc., etc. So I was able to do that. I was also able to revisit my own grandfather's war files. My grandfather, who I mentioned in the introduction of the book, and introduction of the book says one of the ways I came into war history was through my family, and both my grandfathers had served in the First World War. One who had a very heroic story, and the other who was a sort of a story that was never shared. And he came back from the war and suffered from mental ill health. That was my father's father. And in the draft introduction for the first edition of Anzac Memories, when I was writing in the 1980s, I'd said that my grandfather, Hector Thomson, was in and out of mental hospitals after the war. And my father, I showed the draft and he refused to allow me. He just said, you can't publish that. My dad had been in the army. Mental health was a stigma, particularly for war veterans. And he just found it too difficult. And also it was his childhood. He'd grown up with a very unwell father who probably drank too much and on a failing farm. And so I edited. If you read the first edition of Anzac Memories, I changed the introduction and said my grandfather was in and out of hospital. I took out the mental hospital. But when I found his repat files, and he died in the 1950s, but his repat files go from the war right through till his death in the 1950s. And there's really rich evidence in there about what he actually was suffering from. And more than that, my grandmother, who basically made his case to the Veterans Affairs and wrote all the letters about his condition, I suddenly had, and she died in the 1930s, I had all of these handwritten letters from her in this file, and I was able to reconstruct my grandfather's story and work out why he'd ended up in a mental hospital and what damage had been caused by the war. And eventually, and my dad was by this point very old, but I was able to tell him what I'd found in the files, and in a way helped him to understand the difficulty of growing up with a father who'd been mentally affected by war. And it was a very moving experience, both for me. And so I wrote a new chapter for the book about that called Searching for Hector Thomson, and a new chapter's about those three veterans, about what you can learn when you have memories that you've recorded and you put them alongside documentary evidence, and they tell you different things, or sometimes they confirm things. Or sometimes the memories tell you things that the documentary records don't tell you. So returning to those stories through a different source was a fascinating experience. But yeah, that was my first big oral history project.
Yeah, I wasn't aware that the version I read of Anzac Memories was published in 98. So that would have been the second one.
No, the second one came out in 2013. So you probably got a reprint of the first one.
Reprint, okay.
Yeah, but the new edition was in 2013, and it's got three new chapters, basically a section that brings the story forward. And it's also about me changing as a oral historian. When I did the interviews I was 23, and I was a young man interviewing older men. And by the time I came to the second edition, I was an older man myself, and I'd done a lot of different things. I'd suffered some mental health issues myself, and so I had I was a different person returning to these stories and able to ask different questions of it and understand it in different ways. So in a way, the new edition was also about my changes across time as a historian and as a man. Yep.
Wow. The first research, the PhD research, were you then in the history department or in the, another department? We often talked about these academic tribes, right? You talked about this concept. Which tribe were you in at the time?
Well, I started off at Melbourne Uni, and then I got a Commonwealth scholarship. It took me, and originally I was just going for a year to learn about British history on an MA at the University of Sussex. But I just finished doing the interviews in Australia, and they were being transcribed. I had some funding to transcribe them from the War Memorial. And so after I did the MA in England, I came back to Melbourne in 1985, and I determined to be a freelance historian. And so I was working on the book, and I was got employed doing an oral history project on the Melbourne Fire Brigade. I was at the Parliament Oral History Project interviewing retired federal politicians. I taught oral history for the first time through adult education. So I was outside the university sector for a while, but I'd fallen in love in England, and I wanted to go back. And I went back, and the only way I could survive financially without a visa was to take up the rest of the scholarship and do the PhD. So I went back into a history department at Sussex University, which was a wonderful place to be. Because there were people with interest in oral history, but also I'd been very involved in community-based history in Victoria, in Melbourne, and there was a very strong community history group in Brighton on the south of England where Sussex University is based. So I actually, while being a student, I also worked in community publishing, doing community oral history books and working class autobiographies and publishing those over a number of years. So, and that ended up, when I finished my PhD, I actually never worked in a history department again until I came back to Melbourne in 2007. My academic career for about 17 years in England was in a Centre for Continuing Education at the University of Sussex. So I was a university adult educator, teaching oral history and history work, and working with people from a whole range of different disciplines, and with mature students doing community-based projects. So I was not in the history department, and in a way that freed me up and encouraged me to be interdisciplinary in the way that oral historians need to be.
I can imagine that. For exact memories, what was the response of military historians?
It's a good question. Some of the things that I wrote were pretty controversial, particularly challenging some of the mythologies, and conservative historians certainly took a serve at the book and some of the arguments in the book. But it was hard for them to do that because I was using interviews with war veterans, and war veterans are venerated in Australia. And even though some of these war veterans had become pacifists and communists and so on, it was a bit hard for the critics to criticise a story that was based upon veterans' memories. So on the whole, the book was very well received, and I think it probably had one influence in Australia in getting help. It was part of a movement to rethink the remembering of Australian war veterans, and to recognise that putting war veterans up on a pedestal as heroes is really quite damaging to them, because it creates a standard that soldiers have to live up to that's impossible to live up to. And so there are serving soldiers who find a representation of soldiers as vulnerable, and as veterans as suffering a whole range of issues, as being a useful story rather than the more heroic traditional story. So I think there was quite a lot of acceptance of that. And I think probably in the oral history community, the ways I was applying the ideas that people like Sandra Portelli and Louisa Passerini and others, who were thinking in really innovative ways about memory and how to work with memories as a historical source, I guess the book entered into that wider set of debates and developments in oral history around the world.
Right. My students often ask me, right, in the oral history classes I've taught, how do you assess reliability, accuracy? How do you tell when the interview is something to be relied on, to be used? How do you do that?
Great question, and it gets asked in every workshop, and every critic. I mean, it goes back to a longer history of criticism of oral history. Oral history really, for the most part, grows out of a people's history movement and a recognition that we need to record the stories of people whose lives and stories and experiences aren't in the archive because they either didn't document them or their documents weren't preserved. And so our archives are traditionally the archives of the elite and the literate. So oral history has a really important role to play there. And so oral history takes off around the world, including in Australia in the 60s and 70s. I mean, there's also elite oral histories with politicians in America and so on, but the core of the intellectual work of oral history is a sort of people's history and social history. And then the conservative critics really weigh in the 60s and 70s. And the main way they weigh in, I mean, they weigh in because they say the evidence is being created by the historians and that's dodgy. But they also say memories are unreliable, and how can we trust memory sources? And oral historians initially responded in, I guess, what you could call positivistic ways, but useful ways. They reminded historians that every source is a construct, the minutes of a meeting, the letters that we use, Hansard political debates, everything is shaped by the relationships within which things are written or told and what gets preserved and so on. So that's the first response, that actually any historical source needs to be interrogated and critiqued. And a second response was, well, actually, you can look within an interview and across many interviews and at other sources and triangulate oral history evidence. And so if there are serious inaccuracies, you can find them. So that's another response. And I guess the third response that really changed the way we responded to that question was really probably the Sandro Portelli's contribution, and then historians after that, where there's a wonderful essay, which is still a wonderful read, The Death of Luigi Trastulli, which Sandro writes about his hometown of Terni, and Luigi Trastulli was an activist. I think it was in the late 1940s against the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, and he was killed in a small demonstration against NATO. A few years later, in the early 1950s, it's a big industrial town. There's a major industrial action and lockouts, and eventually the workers lose and the industry is decimated. And 20, 30 years later, when Sandro Portelli turns up to interview people about Terni's history, he realises that everybody's misremembering the death of Luigi Trastulli. They're talking about his death, but they're moving it from the 1949 pretty insignificant demonstration against NATO to the 1953 event, which was this seismic event in the city's history. And instead of dismissing all these memories as inaccurate, and he knew that they'd got the date wrong because he could see the police court records and he knew when he died, he said, well, why are the people of Terni misremembering the death of Luigi Trastulli? And what can we learn from that about the significance of that death and the fact that they'd moved his death forward so that they had a martyr figure with symbolic significance for the more important event. So actually what Portelli said is, no, we can learn from the misremembering. Yes, we have to try and work out if something is being misremembered, either because someone's forgotten or because they're wanting to make things up or because memory is complicated, but at least we need to think about what that misremembering is about. And since then, we've learned a lot from psychologists and neuroscientists about how memory works, and we're much better at trying to understand that. And we know now that our short-term memories are rubbish, but our long-term memories, on the one hand, are remarkably robust. Once things get preserved in long-term memory, they're remarkably robust. And we know that when we work with people with dementia who can't remember this morning, but they can remember 40 years ago vividly in great detail. But the paradox of oral history and memory is that it's remarkably robust, but our memory doesn't work like a computer. It's not a storage system where we put down a memory and then we just pull it out exactly. It's an extraordinarily complicated thing, the brain, and the synapses that connect and create our memories are very complicated. And so the process of turning experience into long-term memory is partly about things that are significant. We remember stuff that's significant, and partly about experiences that are storied, creating the stories of our experience and then recreating those stories across time consolidates memory, the long-term memory. And so when we return to an event, when someone triggers us or asks us in an interview to remember something, we will be going back to those long-term memories, but they'll come out in slightly different ways because the circumstances, the relationship, the time of the telling, the subsequent events will all have influenced those stories. And our job as historians is then to work with that really complex but very rich source to understand what it can tell us about events in the past for which we maybe don't have any other sources, like, for example, Holocaust testimony, but also what it can tell us about that person's remembering across time and how their subsequent experiences, their different ways of understanding the world, may have in subtle and maybe significant ways encourage them to reshape, to tell the story in a different way, to make different sense of the story. It doesn't mean they're making it up, but a war veteran who I interviewed basically was unable to talk about shell shock or post-traumatic stress disorder until there was a language to do that, and really not until a recognition of soldiers and victims in the 1960s and 70s began to give a different story. And he could talk about emasculation as a narrative and a way of understanding his disfigurement and his damage during the war in a way that he couldn't talk about in the 1920s. So, just because your story's changed doesn't mean they're inaccurate, but it means you maybe have got a different way of making sense of your past. So it's complicated. There's no easy answer to that question about the reliability of memory. But I would just say in many cases, it's an extraordinary source to put alongside other sources, and you have to work with it very carefully and thoughtfully, just as you do with other historical sources.
Yeah, that's very enlightening, isn't it? That it's a different source from other kinds of the documentary sources, right? Could you maybe talk about, have there been cases where you have used the oral history interview in conjunction with a kind of a report of the battle, and had to reconcile the different perspectives? How do you do that?
I'm just trying to think. I mean, probably the best example is not so much the reporter that battles, although I have done those as well. Actually, I'll give you an example. Fred
Yeah.
Farrell, who's a First World War veteran, from a country kid, goes off to war, feels he's very young, feels very inadequate. He's in the trenches in the First World War, gets chest infections, gets wounded in the leg, and it's a battle of Polygon Wood at Ypres in 1917, and he gets wounded and he crawls back from the front line under terrible fire, and he arrives at a pillbox, and there's a whole lot of German prisoners there, Germans and Australians there. The Australians have captured the pillbox, the Germans are prisoners. And I've got the story that he told me in the interview in 1983 about that event, a long, vivid story about that whole day's experience. And in the story, by this time, 1982, he'd become a pacifist in the 1920s, a communist in the 1930s, an anti-war activist. And so when he tells the story about arriving in this pillbox as a wounded soldier, and these German prisoners are there, and he says, I realized at that moment, why were we fighting each other when we were all here, wounded and injured, helping each other, and the Germans helped carry us away back to behind the lines. So, and that was a story he told as a pacifist story. It was an epiphany moment for him in his storytelling about how the war began to transform his understanding politically. And then in the archives, after Fred had died, he deposited his papers to Melbourne University Archives, and I came across letters that he'd written in 1917 from hospital in England, where he was writing to his family, and particularly to one brother, about that battle. And he describes that moment in the pillbox with the Germans, and he describes it very differently in the letter. In the letter, he talks about how, these Germans and these rats, and we couldn't trust them and whatever. So he's telling a very different story in the letter. And, I have to think hard about the letter. He's writing home to a patriotic country. Maybe he can't share the beginnings of an epiphany. Maybe he doesn't quite recognize at the time that this is a moment that's going to change his thinking. Maybe he wants to tell his brother about how brave he was and how horrible the Germans were. So you've got these different sources. And I guess the way I look at that is that, yes, when he looked back through a political lens 10, 15 years later, he looked back at his war, and this was one of the events where he can see something that helps him understand his war in different ways. And so the pillbox experience, it's complicated, but it takes on a different meaning. And so, you've got these two very different, and they're two different personal records. And again, you could look at the military records of that battle, and there's a lot of those as well. And, there's a lot of prisoners on both sides being shot, and there's a lot of brutality, and there's no doubt he got badly, and there's no doubt that he ended up with shell shock or post-traumatic stress and was profoundly disabled and still in and out of mental hospitals. Just look at him in 1983. He'd just come out of the repatriation hospital after a breakdown. So he was still suffering the war. But there's an example where you have these different documentary and remembered accounts and have to work with them, try and understand them. And it was too late then to ask Fred about the discrepancy because he died. But had there been another occasion where I could have asked, I might have said, okay, let's talk about this difference.
Is there a common way that you would use to, do you talk about these two records like one after the other, or do you try to decide, one is better than the other and you use one instead of the other?
Yeah. Look, I use both together. I mean, the new chapter in the Anzac Memories, the 2013 edition, it's got a whole chapter. Large part of it's about the Fred Farrell story and the way news sources, both those letters and the pension records, made me think hard about what Fred remembered me in 1983 and how, in one way he was using a young, probably quite naive historian to make a political story out of his past. Fair enough. But at the same time, I had the records that showed the type of injuries he'd suffered. You could put those together. So, my history had to be a history both about what happened in 1917, but also what happened politically to Fred in the 20s and 30s, what was still happening to him in the 1980s. And so my oral history had to be about that long span of Australian history and of this man's life, and trying to understand the interconnections between past and present for one person, but also in the wider culture.
Right. I really like the way the discussion is going. So I'm going to just go by the questions that my students have asked me, because I think those are the things that the viewer might, be most interested in. So the second question would be how many? Yeah, how many interviews would be needed? Is there a minimum? Singapore students are always asking about these things.
Yeah, so are Australian students.
Yeah.
Look, a lot of it depends upon your project and your resources. Oral history is time consuming. It takes a lot of time to set up interviews, to conduct interviews, to document interviews so that they're usable, to have an ongoing relationship with your narrators. It's a lot more work than doing archive-based research with documents where you don't have any responsibility to people. So you have to factor that in. A little bit more expensive if you're documenting material, recording equipment, and so on. And nowadays, in most universities, certainly in Australia, you have to get ethics clearance and that well. So my honours students at Monash in the last few years, really hard in a one-year project to do an oral history project because of those constraints. And a PhD student, maybe 4 years to do it in, it's still pretty hard because you're going to spend half of that time creating interviews and so on. So that's going to limit how many interviews you do. Yeah. If you're doing a big project, I've done projects where I've had funding and big funding and I've done that, and I've done projects where I've just done a few. So it depends. But I guess the key thing for a project is what's the type of source material you're trying to create? What are you trying to do with it? And if you're going to do one really rich, detailed interview, you could make a really important piece of writing based on one interview. If you want to look for patterns of experience across a group of people, if it's a PhD, you might want to do maybe 15, 20, 25 interviews, which is the number I did for my PhD. I don't think in a PhD you can do many more than that. And I think deeper, longer interviews are better than many short interviews. The sociologists who do half-hour interviews and say, I've got an interview, you're only just getting started in an oral history interview, warming up, and you're scraping the surface in a half hour. I'm a great believer in longer interviews, and usually 2 sessions. So I reckon from at least a couple of hours with an hour with a break in between, but ideally a second to cut for another couple of hours. So a 4-hour interview, you can really get a lot of rich material out of that. So I have to do 24-hour interviews rather than 41-hour interviews just to get depth and detail. But it depends the type of research you're doing and what you want to do. But if you want to do a type of topic where you can look at patterns across, so for example, my migration project, which was a postdoc project, which is British migrants to Australia, and I wanted to try and explain why do people migrate to Australia, why did they go back to England, what were the ways in which gender affected the experience of migrants, how were families affected, and so on. You need quiz to be able to see patterns across the sources like that. And we actually, interestingly, we asked people to write their stories first, and we got 100 written, and then we did a smaller number of interviews. We did 30 with returned migrants in Britain and 100, between 100 and 200 over time in Australia. So we had a lot of interviews, and from that we could see patterns. We could actually do a little bit of pretty slightly, well, I wouldn't call it qualitative. You could at least see that there were significant factors that came out when you looked across a lot of interviews. But I guess the question is not how many interviews you've got And is it a representative sample? Because it's never a representative sample. It's a sample of survivors, and it's a sample of the willing, people who want to tell you their story. And you always have to ask who survived and who is willing to tell a story. But whatever you've got, the question isn't is it a representative sample? It's rather, who and what does my sample represent? And how might that affect the conclusions that I might make from that sample of interviews? Have I, for example, if our migration project had any migrants, British migrants who stayed in Australia and not any of the 25% who went back to England, then you'd be missing a really important part of that history, and you'd have to acknowledge and talk about that. So the advice I used to give before I stopped last year to grad students was, okay, think about what stories you want to get. Try and get, if you want to look for patterns across, try and get diversity in a sample, different class backgrounds, men and women, and cultural background and so on. But then always ask the question about who and what have I got, and how might I have to then think about the generalizations I can make with that source material.
Yeah, you are making me feel very inadequate, by
Right.
saying you have to go back twice and you have got to do 2 hours.
You don't have to. You don't have to.
No, just kidding.
I think that comes from I'm a great believer in life history interview.
Yeah.
Even if I'm doing a topic-based subject like war or migration, I'm going to understand that topic so much better if I know more about that person's life before their migration, after their migration, before, after the war. And so a life history interview takes a bit longer. But, I think you can do a decent topic-based interview with the life within a couple of hours. But I'm not a great fan of anything less than an hour, because I don't think that person knows you well enough, trusts you well enough, you know them well enough to do the sort of listening carefully, follow-up questions, beginning to get more trusting and more reflective. I don't think you can do that in a short space of time. I think that takes a bit longer.
Yeah, completely true. There was once I was speaking to a geographer, and she said the opposite of you. She said interviews are easy to do. I think she was talking about like a team of interviewers, and that they normally work with, whereas archives take a long time because you've got to read thousands of pages. But I think here we are also talking about the relationship, right? As you just said, and oral history is not just helicopter in and helicopter out. How important is this human relationship with the interviewee?
It's huge. I mean, every interview is going to be shaped by the distinctive relationship in the room. And it's going to be shaped by, is it a man interviewing another man, or is it a cross-gender? Is it a young person and an old person? Is it someone from a different cultural background? Whatever. Or is it a member of their family? Are there other people in the room? All of those relationships and how people perceive each other will affect how comfortable someone feels to talk about their life, what they will or won't talk about, and so on. But at the same time, the experience and the personal qualities of the interviewer, quite apart from their gender and class and all those, that also matters, because actually if someone trusts you just because you're interested in their story, you're a good listener, you're attending to them as they're talking, you're asking useful follow-up questions, they feel supported and guided in the process, then that won't transcend all those other factors, but it'll be really important. So I think probably most people who are good oral history interviewers can interview a pretty wide range of people, but the relationship will affect the stories that are told, and the relationship will change across the course of the hour or 2 hours or across the days. And people will often on day 2 tell you things that they wouldn't have told you on day 1, partly because the process on day 1 has triggered all sorts of remembering, and when you turn up the next day they say, I was up half the night thinking about all the things we talked about, and I forgot to talk about this, and there was this. And that's another reason I like going back another day, because you get that as well. But the relationship is really important, and it's important because it's a very distinctive type of dialogue. It's not a conversation, because it's primarily you encouraging them to tell their story. It's a relationship where you allow pauses and silences to last so much longer than you do in everyday conversation, because you've got to give people space to remember, and you've got to allow them to take their time, and you've got to look at their faces to see whether they're hunting for a memory or whether they're looking at you ready for you to ask another question. yeah, I love, I mean, I'm always nervous every time I turn up to do an interview with a new person.
Yeah.
I'm anxious about it because no idea how it's going to go. No idea whether they're going to be a very reticent person or very talkative, whether they're going to be open, etc. And you've got, and the pre-work you do, giving them information, talking to them on the phone, maybe a pre-interview, that will help with that. But I still, and then you're worried that the recording equipment's all going to work well, and you're trying to manage the recording equipment. You've got the things you want to find out about, but most importantly, you've got to listen to them. You've got to attend to them. So you hear all the clues and cues to ask follow-up questions, maybe half an hour later. You don't want to interrupt them in the middle of a long story, but they've said something like a woman I interviewed once who, middle of a long story, she just said, and I was a real tomboy when I was a kid. And then she carries on. And that's a really revealing statement. And you can't just leave that hanging, but you don't want to interrupt the story. So you just jot down tomboy on your pad. And half an hour later, when there's a gap in the conversation, you come back and say, look, Jill, you said earlier on that you were a tomboy when you were a kid. What does that mean? Tell me about that. And then you get this whole other really rich narrative.
Maybe we can talk about a little bit about the influence of technology here in terms of the human relationship. There are now different ways, like you can do a Zoom interview, or the other thing that I found to be quite useful is the WhatsApp, right? The social messaging platforms where you can kind of, extend the relationship a little bit, but not in a very typical face-to-face way. You can just pop them a question, and if they are helpful, they are interested, then they will reply. Do you have you kind of followed the changes, the introduction of new technology, and how that has affected the use of oral history?
Yeah, look, I think in many ways, I don't think the shift from analog to digital recording has profoundly changed the interview experience. It's easier in some ways. I think it's easier to do a good quality interview with digital recording than the old cassettes. Um, Easier to learn and easier to use. I think the biggest changes with technology have been what happens to interviews afterwards. Our ability to now to use AI, automatic transcription, use AI to do summaries or even time summaries, which need to be checked and proofread and corrected. Our ability to work with digital sound recordings, maybe linked to transcription, to use them in a whole range of multimedia formats. But that's been transformative. Our ability to put into digital recordings online and make them accessible and shareable around the world has just opened up. In terms of that transforming the archive, that's an apotheosis moment that actually the archive can be just so rich and available, which has created other ethical issues about privacy and about use and abuse and how you manage that, and big issues for archives with legacy collections where the rights forms obviously didn't think about the internet. And when someone gave permission for their interview to be public, did they mean publicly online? So I was doing a training course yesterday with 24 public librarians from around Victoria. They've all got collections that were created in the 1980s when there was a real boom moment for community-based oral history in Australia. And these local libraries have got these legacy collections of cassettes, which they can digitise, but the rights agreements are more or less okay, but they didn't have any idea about the internet. And so they're thinking, what can we do? How can we make these available? So the technologies are enabling all sorts of things to be done with oral history, but they're taking us, they're stretching our ethical dilemmas in new directions and require us to think hard about things like the fact that if you've done a life history interview and it's full of information about a person and their date of birth and their mother's maiden name, and good hackers can use that to basically find out people's passwords and things like that. So we have to be more cautious, I think, about privacy. We have to think more carefully about how other people are named and defamation. We now know, since the Boston College case in Ireland, that even a closed interview can be subpoenaed and opened by the police if they think there's illegal activity mentioned in the interview. So the ability to create digital recordings and put them online has opened up a can of worms, while at the same time enabling extraordinary historical research and understanding. Just going back to your first question, I don't think how I conduct an interview now in the room is very different. But as you say, and we're doing this, you're in Singapore, I'm in Melbourne, COVID transformed the name of the game in terms of making remote interviews necessary for a time and developing helping us learn about and use a whole range of new technologies. So it's now possible to do remote interviewing. And sometimes people prefer that because they're worried about health issues or they're a long way away, saves money. Personally, I like being in the room. I think being in someone's home is a really often an extraordinary place to conduct an interview because all the evidence of their life is around them and it's where they feel very comfortable.
Yep.
But, and so, yeah, so wherever possible, I still prefer, if I'm doing archive-based interviews, I'd rather do it in the room. And I still do audio interviews and rather than filmed interviews. But I absolutely recognise that, doing interviews like this is now an option that wasn't. And so that's transformative.
Yeah.
Not for me personally. I do a lot of interviews like this when I was teaching. I would suddenly you were able to get the American expert like Michael Frisch or Hank Greenspan and others to talk to your students for half an hour in Melbourne by doing a recording with them, and that's magical and wonderful. So, the internet and Zoom technology is transforming all sorts of things, including what we can do in oral history. But and the relationship, we talked about the importance of the relationship. The relationship when you're not in the same room is slightly different. It maybe for some people enables them to open up more frankly, maybe not. But it's just another thing for us to factor into as a possibility and to think about, okay, how is the story being told differently because it's being told online through an online recording.
Yeah, me too. I still prefer. I still ask to go to people's houses. Sometimes people are a bit shy about that, but that's still my preference.